Before there was rebellion, there was restriction. Long before colonists dreamed of independence or penned declarations about liberty, they chafed under economic chains forged in London and locked tight around colonial commerce. The British Navigation Acts, passed throughout the 17th century, were designed with mercantilist precision to ensure that colonial wealth flowed in one direction only toward the mother country, enriching English merchants and filling crown coffers while keeping colonists perpetually dependent on imperial trade networks they could neither escape nor challenge legally. The system was elegant in its exploitation. Colonists could sell their most valuable goods, tobacco, indigo, naval stores, only to Britain or British-controlled ports, regardless of whether better prices existed elsewhere in Europe or the Caribbean. Ships carrying colonial cargo had to be British-built and British-crewed, eliminating competition from Dutch or French vessels that might have offered colonists better terms. Manufactured goods from Europe had to pass through English ports first, where middlemen took their cut, before being reshipped to America at inflated prices that enriched London merchants while impoverishing colonial consumers who paid artificially high costs for everything from textiles to tea. The economic suffocation was intentional, born from mercantilist theory that viewed colonies as existing solely to benefit the empire, providing raw materials cheaply and purchasing finished goods expensively in closed system that prevented colonial manufacturing or independent trade that might compete with British interests. Parliament saw nothing unjust in this arrangement, believing colonies existed to serve imperial purposes rather than their own prosperity. But colonists increasingly viewed these restrictions as intolerable burdens that violated their rights as Englishmen to engage in free commerce and pursue economic opportunities without artificial constraints imposed by distant legislators, who cared nothing for colonial welfare. This economic resentment predated political grievances by generations, creating foundation of colonial defiance that would eventually explode into revolution. The chains were economic long before they became political, and colonists learned to resist through commerce before they resisted through warfare. Where there was coastline, there was defiance. New England's jagged shores and countless harbours became America's first frontier of resistance, where geography conspired with human ingenuity to undermine imperial trade restrictions that looked enforceable on London maps but proved impossible to police across thousands of miles of coastline dotted with hidden coves and fishing, villages whose loyalties lay with profit rather than Parliament. Boston, Newport, and Salem transformed from modest colonial ports into bustling centres of commerce, both legal and decidedly illegal, their wharves crowded with ships whose captains knew how to navigate customs regulations as skillfully as they navigated Atlantic storms. The fishermen who worked these waters were not natural criminals, but economic necessity and opportunity transformed them into smugglers as casually as tide transforms shoreline. They knew every inlet and channel, every sheltered bay where cargo could be transferred from ship to smaller boat, beyond sight of customs officials stationed in major ports. Their knowledge of local waters gave them advantages that British customs enforcement could never overcome, allowing them to land contraband goods and evade duties that would have doubled the price of sugar, molasses, and rum that fueled New England's economy and social life. Merchants who organized this illicit trade were respectable members of colonial society, attending church on Sunday and bribing customs officials on Monday, with equal conviction that both activities served legitimate purposes. They saw nothing immoral in evading laws they considered unjust impositions on their natural right to engage in free trade with whoever offered best terms. Profit met principle on New England docks, creating merchant class whose wealth derived from defying imperial authority and whose economic interests would eventually align perfectly with political rebellion when Britain attempted to enforce trade restrictions that colonists had been ignoring profitably for decades. The smugglers' coast bred a culture of independence that no amount of British naval power could suppress, teaching colonists that imperial authority could be defied successfully if they possessed courage and cunning. Empire's rules ended where the horizon began. Beyond sight of land and reach of customs officials, the Atlantic Ocean became vast marketplace where colonial merchants traded freely according to supply and demand rather than parliamentary decree. creating networks of illegal commerce that enriched colonial ports while draining revenue from crown coffers that expected to profit from every transaction within the empire. The infamous triangle trade moved molasses from French Caribbean islands to New England distilleries, rum from those distilleries to Africa for enslaved people, and gold and colonial ships back across Atlantic, with profits that never touched British ports or paid British duties as navigation acts required. This transatlantic black market operated with stunning efficiency, involving thousands of sailors, merchants, ship captains, and colonial officials who either participated directly in smuggling or accepted bribes to ignore it. French planters in Martinique and Guadeloupe were happy to sell molasses to New England merchants at prices far below what British Caribbean islands charged, creating economic incentive for illegal trade that no amount of royal proclamation could eliminate. New England distillers transformed that smuggled molasses into rum that became currency throughout Atlantic world, traded for everything from enslaved laborers to European manufactured goods in transactions that bypassed British control entirely. The wealth generated by this illegal commerce funded much of colonial development in 18th century, building the great merchant houses of Boston and Newport, financing colonial infrastructure and institutions, and creating a prosperous merchant class whose economic power rivaled that of British traders who operated within legal frameworks but could not compete with smugglers' lower costs. This underground economy also created culture of defiance and self-reliance that would prove crucial when political rebellion required colonists to act collectively against British authority. Smuggling taught colonists that they could prosper by ignoring London's rules, that imperial authority was more theoretical than practical, beyond Britain's immediate reach, and that their economic future lay in free trade rather than mercantilist restriction. Before they flew the Stars and Stripes, they flew the Black Flag. The line between piracy and legitimate commerce blurred along colonial coasts throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries, with same ships and often same crews engaging in both, depending on circumstances and opportunities that presented themselves on Atlantic voyages, where legal authority dissolved into practical calculations about profit and risk. Colonial harbour masters who enforced trade regulations during daylight hours quietly conducted business with pirates after dark, accepting bribes and purchasing stolen goods that would be resold as legitimate cargo once paperwork was forged and customs officials were paid to overlook suspicious origins. Henry Every became folk hero in colonial America after capturing Mughal treasure ship in 1695, demonstrating that individual daring could defeat imperial power and generate wealth beyond anything legitimate trade offered to common sailors and merchants. His success inspired others to try their fortunes on account, sailing under no nation's flag but their own, preying on shipping from any country whose vessels appeared vulnerable and whose cargo seemed valuable. Colonial ports welcomed these pirates despite official condemnation, recognizing that their stolen goods sold cheaply and their spending enriched local economies in ways that legal trade constrained by navigation acts could never match. Blackbeard terrorized Carolina coast in 17 teens, yet maintained relationships with colonial governors who accepted his bribes and turned blind eyes to his activities in exchange for shares of plunder and political support. This corruption ran so deep that when Britain finally sent navy to suppress piracy, they found colonial populations more sympathetic to pirates than to royal authority attempting to impose order that would eliminate profitable relationships between outlaws and supposedly law-abiding colonists. The pirate era taught colonists that imperial authority was negotiable, that profit could excuse almost any violation of law, and that daring men operating outside legal systems could sometimes achieve more than those who followed rules designed to keep them subordinate and poor. As long as the gold flowed, London didn't look too closely. The British Empire's relationship with colonial smuggling was study in hypocrisy, with officials in London condemning illegal trade in public speeches while privately accepting that customs revenue collected from colonies, even diminished by widespread smuggling, still exceeded what could be extracted through strict enforcement that would require military occupation and constant surveillance impossible to maintain across Atlantic distances. Crown officials calculated that some smuggling was acceptable cost of maintaining colonial loyalty and avoiding enforcement expenses that would consume more than the additional revenue might generate. Corruption permeated the customs service from top to bottom, with positions as customs collectors viewed as opportunities for personal enrichment through bribes rather than as public service, requiring enforcement of unpopular laws against populations who considered smuggling their natural right. Customs officials who attempted honest enforcement found themselves ostracized by colonial communities, threatened by smugglers, and undermined by superiors who preferred profitable corruption to unprofitable integrity. Many collectors simply abandoned any pretense of enforcement, accepting regular payments from major smugglers in exchange for falsifying paperwork and ignoring obvious violations that everyone knew were occurring but no one officially acknowledged. This imperial hypocrisy gave smugglers room to thrive and expand their operations beyond what careful enforcement might have allowed, creating massive underground economy that enriched colonists while theoretically remaining subject to British law. The system worked as long as both sides maintained pretense, Britain claiming authority it did not actually exercise, colonists acknowledging laws they did not actually obey. But this arrangement was inherently unstable, requiring continued British willingness to accept symbolic compliance rather than demanding real obedience. When Britain finally decided to enforce trade laws strictly in the 1760s, colonists reacted with outrage, not because laws had changed, but because the unspoken arrangement had been violated, destroying equilibrium that had allowed both empire and colonies to profit from a system neither fully believed in. The Revolution's richest man made his fortune breaking the law. John Hancock inherited prosperous merchant business from his uncle and expanded it through systematic smuggling that made him wealthiest man in New England and symbol of colonial defiance against British trade restrictions that he violated. Daily, with fleets of ships bringing illegal goods into Boston Harbor, his wealth was so conspicuous and his smuggling so brazen that British customs officials targeted him specifically in 1768, seizing his ship Liberty for customs violations in action designed to demonstrate that even most powerful colonial merchants were subject to British authority and could not flaunt trade laws with impunity. The Liberty incident backfired spectacularly for British authorities. Rather than intimidating other smugglers into compliance, the seizure provoked riots in Boston as crowds attacked customs officials and drove them from their homes, demonstrating that colonial populations would defend smugglers against British enforcement rather than accept restrictions on trade they considered their natural right. Hancock became hero for his resistance. His criminal activity transformed into patriotic defiance through popular interpretation that refused to accept British legitimacy in regulating colonial commerce. His wealth, derived entirely from illegal trade, gave him resources to fund revolutionary activity and social position to lead resistance movement that would eventually seek independence rather than merely reform of trade policies. Hancock's transformation from smuggler to statesman illustrated how economic rebellion merged with political resistance in pre-revolutionary America, with same acts and same people simply reframed as patriotic rather than criminal, once political context shifted toward revolution. His fine clothes and elegant mansion, all purchased with smuggling profits, became symbols of colonial prosperity achieved despite rather than because of British rule. When smuggling became patriotism in fine clothes, the revolution gained respectability and resources that pure political idealism could never have provided, proving that economic self-interest and political principle could reinforce each other powerfully when circumstances aligned them toward common cause. It wasn't tea that first boiled the colonies, it was taxes. Throughout the 1760s, British attempts to enforce trade regulations and collect customs duties sparked violent confrontations in colonial ports, where populations had grown accustomed to smuggling with minimal interference and viewed any serious enforcement as intolerable innovation rather than legitimate application of long-standing laws. The Sugar Act of 1764 reduced the duty on molasses, but promised rigorous enforcement, calculating that lower rates actually collected would generate more revenue than higher rates universally evaded. Colonial merchants understood this logic and recognized that effective enforcement threatened their entire business model, built on systematic duty evasion. Customs officials who attempted to enforce the new policies faced mob violence that made their work impossible and their lives dangerous, with crowds attacking their homes, burning their belongings, and forcing them to flee to British warships in harbour for protection from populations that considered customs enforcement a form of tyranny deserving violent resistance. These were not spontaneous explosions of anger, but organised demonstrations coordinated by merchants whose smuggling operations faced disruption and who mobilised dockworkers and sailors whose livelihoods depended on illegal trade to defend their collective economic interests through intimidation and violence. The customs wars politicised colonial populations who might otherwise have remained indifferent to abstract constitutional debates about parliamentary sovereignty and colonial rights, giving them concrete economic reasons to oppose British authority that affected their daily lives and material prosperity. A dockworker who cared nothing about taxation without representation cared intensely about losing his job because customs enforcement eliminated smuggling that employed him. This economic awakening preceded and enabled political awakening, teaching colonists that their interests diverged from Britain's and that resistance was both necessary and possible. Political rebellion, sparked by economic restrictions, proved more durable and widespread than pure ideological resistance might have been, because it affected nearly everyone in coastal colonies whose prosperity depended directly or indirectly on maritime trade that British enforcement threatened to strangle. The revolution began with cargo, not cannons. In Boston, between 1768 and 1773, the infrastructure of smuggling transformed seamlessly into infrastructure of political resistance, with same networks that moved illegal goods now moving revolutionary correspondence, coordinating protests, and organizing boycotts that gave political resistance economic teeth through collective refusal to purchase British imports. The docks became centers of revolutionary activity because they were already centers of organized defiance, populated by men accustomed to operating outside law and evading British authority as routine business practice. Dockworkers, sailors, and merchants who had cooperated in smuggling operations found political common cause defending their economic interests against British crackdowns that threatened livelihoods built on illegal trade. These men formed core of revolutionary crowds that intimidated loyalists, prevented customs enforcement, and demonstrated that British authority could not be imposed on Boston without military occupation, that would treat colonists as conquered enemies rather than British subjects entitled to rights and self-governance. Their unity derived less from abstract political philosophy than from shared economic stakes in maintaining a system that allowed them to prosper through trade that British law prohibited, but colonial practice normalized. The committees that coordinated resistance in Boston emerged directly from smuggling networks that already possessed organizational structures, communication channels, and collective discipline necessary for effective political action. Leaders like Samuel Adams understood that dockside solidarity could be channeled into political resistance, transforming economic grievances into revolutionary movement by linking trade restrictions to larger questions about colonial rights and British tyranny. The rhetoric of liberty and natural rights provided moral framework for resistance, whose immediate motivation was protecting illegal commerce from British interference. Liberty on the docks meant freedom to smuggle, before it meant independence from Britain, but the first led naturally to the second, once colonists recognized that their economic and political interests were inseparable from question of who would govern America, distant parliament, or colonial assemblies. The Tea Party wasn't about tea, it was about control. The East India Company monopoly, granted by Parliament in 1773, threatened not just colonial smugglers who had been importing cheaper Dutch tea illegally for years, but the entire principle of colonial economic autonomy that smuggling represented and defended against British attempts to regulate every aspect of colonial commerce. The Tea Act actually lowered the price of legal British tea, making it competitive with smuggled Dutch tea for first time, but colonists recognised that accepting this arrangement would mean accepting Parliament's right to grant monopolies, and control trade in ways that benefited British companies while subordinating colonial economic interests to imperial priorities. Colonial tea smugglers had built lucrative businesses importing superior Dutch tea and selling it throughout colonies at prices British East India Company could not match while paying duties and operating within legal restrictions that smugglers ignored entirely. These smugglers were not defending principle against profit, but defending profitable system against British attempt to undercut their prices through corporate monopoly backed by parliamentary authority. Their economic motivation aligned perfectly with political argument that Parliament lacked authority to impose such arrangements on colonists who had never consented to being subordinated to British corporate interests. The destruction of tea in Boston Harbor in December 1773 was organized by merchants whose smuggling operations faced ruin if East India Company monopoly succeeded, demonstrating that political resistance and economic self-interest reinforced each other in ways that made distinguishing between them impossible and perhaps irrelevant. The participants understood themselves as defending both liberty and livelihood, both principle and profit, both colonial rights and smuggling income that British policy threatened to eliminate through combination of lower prices and enforcement that monopoly would enable. Smugglers were early rebels against corporate and imperial power, not from idealism, but from recognition that their prosperity depended on resisting British control over colonial commerce, making them natural allies of political resistance that sought same goal through constitutional argument that smugglers pursued through illegal trade. When trade became treason, smugglers became soldiers. As tensions escalated between 1774 and 1776, the networks that had moved illegal molasses and tea through colonial ports shifted seamlessly to moving gunpowder, weapons, and military supplies that British authorities were desperately trying to prevent from reaching colonial militia preparing for armed conflict. Smuggling infrastructure built over decades for profit now served revolutionary cause from necessity, with same ships, same captains, same hidden routes, and same bribes to officials now applied to military logistics instead of commercial trade. The transition was natural because skills required were identical, evading British surveillance, moving cargo secretly, coordinating complex operations across distances, and accepting risks for potential rewards. Colonial militias needed weapons and powder that British policy prohibited them from importing or manufacturing, creating desperate supply crisis that only smuggling networks could address in months before fighting began at Lexington and Concord. European merchants, particularly French and Dutch, were willing to sell military supplies to colonists despite British protests, seeing opportunity for profit and chance to weaken their perpetual rival Britain by supporting colonial rebellion. But getting those supplies from European ports to colonial militias required smuggling operations sophisticated enough to evade British naval patrols and customs enforcement that watched specifically for military contraband. The smugglers who provided this service were indispensable to revolutionary cause in ways that histories focusing on military battles and political debates often minimize or ignore entirely. Without illegal arms trade, colonial resistance would have collapsed for lack of ammunition before independence could be declared or defended militarily. Underground commerce became revolution's lifeline, proving that military success required logistical foundation that only criminal networks possessed capability and willingness to provide. From contraband to cause, the transformation was complete. Smugglers, who had defied British trade law from economic motivation, now defied British military power from political necessity, their criminal expertise repurposed as patriotic service that made independence militarily feasible rather than merely political aspiration. Washington's navy was built on borrowed ships and bold men. The Continental Congress, desperate for naval power to challenge British maritime supremacy but lacking resources to construct proper warships, legalized privateering in 1776 through letters of marque that authorized private vessels to attack British shipping and keep captured cargo as legitimate prize of war rather than illegal plunder. This policy transformed smugglers and merchant sailors into quasi-military force that served revolutionary cause while pursuing private profit, creating arrangement where patriotism and self-interest aligned perfectly to motivate aggressive naval warfare against British commerce. The privateers who accepted these commissions were not motivated primarily by political ideology, but by extraordinary profit potential that privateering offered to sailors willing to risk capture and execution if caught by British Navy, that considered them pirates despite American claims that letters of marque made their activities legitimate warfare. A successful cruise could make crew wealthy beyond anything legitimate trade or military service offered, with prize money distributed among officers and sailors, according to established shares that made even common seamen rich if they captured valuable British merchantmen loaded with supplies or luxury goods. Thousands of American sailors chose privateering over service in Continental Army or Navy, drawn by combination of freedom from military discipline and potential for personal enrichment that made privateering more attractive than regular military service, despite comparable or greater dangers. Their choice demonstrated that revolutionary cause could motivate through self-interest as effectively as through ideology, that independence could be fought for profit without diminishing legitimacy of resistance to British authority. Sailors chasing fortune and freedom under new flag became revolution's naval force, through private initiative that government could never have organized or funded through conventional military structures, proving that revolutionary movements can harness human motivations of all kinds, idealistic and mercenary, selfless and selfish, into effective resistance against superior conventional military power. For every British ship captured, a fortune and a future was made. American privateers seized over 2,000 British vessels during the Revolution, disrupting supply lines that British forces in America depended on for everything from food to ammunition, while generating millions of pounds in prize money that enriched privateer crews and funded revolutionary cause through taxes on prizes and purchases of supplies for Continental Army. This maritime guerrilla warfare proved far more effective than conventional naval battles between American and British warships could ever have been, because privateers operated independently and opportunistically, avoiding British naval strength while exploiting British merchant vulnerability. British merchants and insurers lobbied Parliament desperately for better convoy protection and stronger naval patrols, watching helplessly as privateers made American waters, and even British home waters, dangerous for commercial shipping that should have been secure under Royal Navy protection. The economic impact exceeded military significance, driving up insurance rates, causing supply shortages, and demonstrating that Britain could not protect its commerce, even while maintaining largest navy in world. This undermined British public support for continuing expensive war that was supposed to quickly crush colonial rebellion, but instead dragged on inconclusively, while British shipping suffered losses that affected every merchant and consumer in Britain. Privateering transformed economic rebellion that had begun with smuggling into military strategy that directly supported independence movement by weakening British economy and war effort simultaneously. The same colonial merchants who had smuggled goods before the war now captured British ships legally under American letters of marque, their transition from criminals to patriots complete through accident of timing that made their skills and inclinations valuable to revolutionary cause. Maritime defiance that had begun as protest against trade restrictions culminated in naval warfare that contributed substantially to achieving independence. Those trade restrictions had made desirable and necessary. The privateers proved that irregular warfare prosecuted by profit-motivated civilians could achieve strategic objectives that conventional military forces could not accomplish with limited resources available to revolutionary movement, fighting against global imperial power. In backrooms and hidden bays, America found its first allies. Long before France officially recognized American independence in 1778, French merchants and colonial officials in Caribbean were conducting secret trade with American smugglers, providing military supplies, purchasing American goods, and generally undermining British war effort through commercial relationships that violated French neutrality, but served French interests by supporting British enemy, without requiring formal military commitment that might provoke war, before France was prepared. The smuggling routes that had moved molasses and sugar between French Caribbean islands and American ports, before the war now moved gunpowder, weapons, and military supplies from French arsenals to American forces, Desperate for materiel, they could not manufacture domestically in quantities required for sustained warfare. French colonial governors accepted bribes to ignore this illegal trade. Understanding that Paris wanted American rebellion to succeed, but could not officially support it until American victory seemed achievable enough to justify French military intervention that would inevitably lead to war with Britain. These secret deals kept revolution alive during desperate years when American forces lacked supplies for continued resistance and when formal French alliance remained politically impossible because France needed evidence that Americans could actually win before committing openly to supporting their cause. Smugglers served as unofficial diplomats, building relationships with French contacts that would facilitate formal alliance once political circumstances permitted France to acknowledge publicly what it had been doing secretly through Caribbean intermediaries and front companies, like Rodrigo Hortales, that provided French government supplies while maintaining fiction of private commercial transactions. The French connection demonstrated that smuggling networks created during peacetime resistance to British trade restrictions transformed naturally into wartime supply lines and diplomatic channels that served military and political purposes beyond their original economic functions, proving that infrastructure of illegal commerce could be repurposed for revolutionary logistics and international relations when circumstances required such adaptation. Yesterday's criminals became the Republic's pioneers. After American victory secured independence and established United States as sovereign nation, privateers and smugglers who had served revolutionary cause through illegal commerce and quasi-legal naval warfare found themselves celebrated as heroes rather than prosecuted as criminals, their wartime contributions earning them legitimacy and social status that peacetime smuggling could never have provided. The post-war trade boom created opportunities for maritime entrepreneurs who understood international commerce and possessed ships, contacts, and experience gained through years of operating outside legal restrictions that British authority had attempted unsuccessfully to enforce. Former privateers, captains became respected merchants, their prize money invested in legitimate trading ventures that exploited newly opened markets and commercial relationships that independence made possible without British restrictions on colonial trade. Men who had captured British ships during the war now traded with British merchants in peacetime, their former enmity forgotten in pursuit of profit that benefited both sides. Once political conflict no longer prevented mutually advantageous commercial relationships. Their transition from warriors to businessmen was seamless because their skills, navigation, negotiation, risk assessment, commercial networking transferred directly from privateering to legitimate maritime trade. The early American Navy drew heavily on privateering veterans who understood naval warfare and possessed seamanship that young Republic needed, as it established itself as maritime nation, capable of protecting its commerce and asserting its sovereignty against European powers who might otherwise have treated American shipping with contempt. The daring and independence that made privateers effective during Revolution became foundation of American naval tradition that celebrated individual initiative and aggressive action rather than rigid discipline and cautious adherence to rules of engagement that characterized British naval culture. Men once hunted as outlaws became symbols of American daring, their transformation from smugglers to patriots to respected citizens, demonstrating that revolution's success depended on people whose motivations mixed principle and profit, whose contributions came from skills developed through illegal activities, and whose legitimacy derived from victory rather than virtue. Old habits die hard and profit dies harder. American merchants, smugglers, and former privateers flooded into Caribbean after the Revolution, pursuing trade opportunities in region where European colonial powers maintained mercantilist restrictions similar to those Americans had just fought to escape. The irony was inescapable. Americans who had rebelled against British trade restrictions now evaded French, Spanish, and British trade laws in Caribbean with same enthusiasm and same methods they had employed before independence, demonstrating that their objection had been to restrictions on their commerce rather than to principle of mercantilism itself. The Caribbean became testing ground for American commercial expansion and American willingness to operate outside international legal frameworks when profit justified risk, pattern that would characterize American economic behavior for next century as republic expanded westward and southward, with mixture of legitimate commerce and illegal activities that served national interests while enriching individual entrepreneurs. Former revolutionaries who had celebrated liberty and natural rights during the war showed little hesitation about participating in Caribbean slave trade and other morally questionable commerce when opportunities presented themselves in post-war period. The United States inherited same temptations that had shaped British imperial behavior: desire to control trade routes, establish commercial monopolies, and subordinate weaker nations' economic interests to American priorities. American merchants wanted access to all markets on favorable terms, while resisting other nations' attempts to impose similar conditions on American trade, reproducing imperial double standards that Americans had condemned when Britain applied them to colonies. The Battle for Caribbean demonstrated that independence transformed American relationship with empire from subject to competitor, rather than eliminating imperial impulses that had motivated British policy, suggesting that problem was not imperialism itself, but who controlled it and who benefited from the wealth it generated through restricted trade and enforced monopolies. A nation born of rebellion never fully lost its taste for risk. Smuggling persisted in early United States, despite government efforts to collect customs duties that provided substantial portion of federal revenue under Constitution, ratified in 1789. With same populations that had smuggled to defy British authority, now smuggling to avoid American taxes, they considered excessive or unjust, depending on their political perspective and economic interests. The spirit of defiance that had made revolution possible proved difficult to channel into respect for American law once independence was secured, and new government attempted to assert authority that looked uncomfortably similar to British impositions colonists had resisted violently. Frontier expansion created new opportunities for smuggling, as American settlement pushed westward and southward into territories where government authority remained theoretical, and enforcement was impossible due to distance and lack of infrastructure necessary for effective customs collection. Traders operating along frontier dealt with Native American nations, Spanish and French colonial authorities, and other Americans with minimal regard for laws passed in distant capital by government that seemed as remote as Parliament had been before Revolution. This frontier lawlessness became part of American identity, celebrated in folklore and politics as frontier spirit, even when it violated laws and undermined government revenue collection. The persistence of smuggling in American commerce shaped early capitalism, with mixture of entrepreneurial innovation and legal violations that made American business culture distinctive from European models, where government regulation and legal frameworks constrained commercial activity more effectively. American merchants and traders operated with independence and opportunism, born from experience evading British authority and confidence that government enforcement would remain limited enough to allow profitable violations if executed carefully. How defiance shaped American identity and capitalism demonstrates that revolutionary origins influenced national character in ways that extended far beyond political institutions and constitutional arrangements to affect economic behavior, and cultural attitudes toward authority, risk, and individual initiative that would distinguish American society from European nations whose histories followed different paths toward modernity. They broke the law and built a nation from its pieces. The moral paradox of America's birth through illegal enterprise challenges comfortable narratives about revolutionary virtue and founding principles, forcing recognition that independence was achieved through systematic violations of British law by people whose motivations mixed idealism with self-interest, whose courage served economic goals as much as political principles, and whose contribution to revolutionary cause derived from skills developed through criminal activities that polite society would normally condemn. Smugglers and privateers were hidden architects of independence because they provided economic foundation and military capability that made resistance sustainable and victory achievable against superior British power. The founding generation understood this complexity better than later Americans, who preferred simple stories about heroic patriots fighting for universal principles. but founders themselves rarely acknowledged publicly how much revolutionary success depended on illegal commerce and quasi-criminal networks that legitimate history minimized or ignored entirely. John Hancock's wealth came from smuggling, but his official reputation emphasized his political leadership and patriotic sacrifice rather than his systematic violation of customs laws that made his fortune. Privateers who captured British ships were celebrated as naval heroes rather than examined as motivated primarily by prize money rather than ideology. This selective memory served nation-building purposes by creating founding mythology that emphasized virtue and principle over profit and pragmatism, but it distorted historical reality in ways that made revolutionary origins seem more idealistic and less mercenary than actual events demonstrated. The truth is messier and perhaps more interesting that revolutions succeeded through coalition of people with different motivations, that independence was fought for both worthy and unworthy reasons, that founders were neither saints nor villains but humans, who mixed idealism and self-interest in proportions that varied individually but collectively produced political transformation. Smugglers and pirates as architects of American independence and economic power reminds us that nations emerge from complex processes involving all types of people and motivations, that heroism and criminality can coexist in same individuals, and that judging past by present standards obscures more than it illuminates about how history actually unfolds through human choices, made under circumstances we can barely imagine from comfortable distance of centuries. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.